Hello and welcome to Glastonbury. Let's get right to it. If I yield to it, he kept repeating, while the image that worked the madness in him slid again into the fibers of his being and nestled there like a soft-winged bird. And his imagination, as they drew near St. Michael's Inn, settled itself like a dung-wasp upon the nature of his conscious life as if he did yield to it. He saw his soul in the form of an unspeakable worm, writhing in pursuit of new and even new mental victims, drinking new and ever new innocent blood. And he was the face of this worm. And it happened to him now that he obtained what is given to few to obtain, an actual certain knowledge of what thoughts there were, if they could be called thoughts, that would come to stir in the darkness under the mask of that face that was no face. Absolutely alone except for his consciousness of a certain little round red eye, the eye of the evil and the double-natured first cause, fixed upon it with a bottomless enjoyment of its suffering, the worst of the thoughts of this creature would be the intolerable effort required of it if it were to struggle to escape its doom. It would know that it could escape if it struggled, but the effort would be worse than what it suffered. And it would know its doom. It would see remorse slowly changing its nature and becoming something else in the process of self-torture. It would know that its doom was no crushing annihilation, but a death as slow as the disintegration of certain mineral deposits, which under chemical pressure gradually lose their identity and are converted into atmospheric dust. Amorphous dust. They were now passing the entrance to St. Michael's Inn, a simple little tavern frequented chiefly by the poorer class and possessed of only 2 stories. As Mr. Evans cast his eyes upon the window of the upper story, he saw the muslin curtains of one of those pulled aside. They were not pulled far, only a little way, and the hand that pulled them remained clutching them tightly as if in fear of being interfered with. Between these curtains, Mr. Evans saw a face looking out at him, apparently the face of a woman. The head of this apparition shocked Mr. Evans, and indeed caused him to feel queasy in the pit of his stomach, for it was totally bald. An ordinary observer would have regarded this face as that of an idiot, but Mr. Evans knew better. It was the face of a remorseful sadist. Yes, it was a face of unspeakable cruelty, but the nature of its cruelty had changed. The mind behind that face was still occupied with devices for causing suffering, but the object of these devices was no longer, by the blessed interposition of chance, external to the woman herself. He imagined her, or rather he saw her, for the woman looked at him, and he looked at the woman, slowly torturing herself to death. And this by a process that Mr. Evans completely understood. It was a process of pleasure-killing. He knew the part played by this process by everything in the woman's room. He saw her refusing to pick up crumbs from the floor, although to remove crumbs from the floor was a pleasure to her. He saw her draw the muslin curtains around the window when it rained, and he knew she liked rain, and drawing them back when the sun shone. And he knew she loathed the sun. He could see the chair she longed to sit upon and never allow herself to sit upon. He could hear the ticking of the clock, which she wound up so carefully every night, although it was the ticking of this clock more than anything else that she found intolerable. Mr. Evans was well aware of the efforts that the people of the house must be making all the while to persuade the woman to cease this maniacal self-punishment, this slow murdering of all the little diurnal sensations of pleasure. But these efforts were doubtless of no avail. Oh, no. They were wrong to call her an idiot. Mr. Evans knew all about her. He knew how she poured water out of her washing jug over into the red coals in her grate, the minute she caught herself getting any pleasure from the warmth. He knew, but he had already lingered ridiculously long behind John and Sam. He must catch them up. They arrived now at an old rickety gate, on their right, which led direct into the Torfield, where at Michaelmas for 1,000 years the great Glastonbury Fair had been held. although of recent years it had been moved to a meadow on the further side of the town. Sam opened the gate, and they all three entered the field. When Sam returned to his companions after lifting the gate back into place, he was met by a somewhat bewildered, vaguely appealing stare from both of them. It was entirely instinctive, this movement of theirs. It must have been a deep and conscious impulse. Just in this manner, on countless forgotten pilgrimages, men must have turned to some fate-appointed leader drawn by what Mr. Weatherwax would have called natural authority. It was as if they both secretly in their hearts expected Sam to say, "Follow me up the hill." Sam, however, said nothing of the sort. He laid down his parcel on the grass and began searching about on the side of an ancient fallen tree for a certain kind of moss that he knew grew here, or of a rather uncommon variety. John and Mr. Evans both turned their eyes to St. Michael's Tower. The tower upon Glastonbury Tor varies its appearance as much as any hill erection in Wessex. This is due to the extraordinary variety of atmospheric changes which the climate of this district evokes. On this particular day, the weather condition had assumed a cloud pattern, an air pressure, a perspective of light and shadow, such as dwellers in Glastonbury recognize as more natural and normal than any other. All over the surfaces of the sky extended a feathery white firm film of vapor. The effect of this filmy screen upon the sun was to make it seem as if it shone through a roof of water. As a matter of fact, this vaporous film reduced the sun rays to so mild a diffusion that they ceased to be rays. The sun's orb, thus shorn of its outpouring of radiance, came to resemble the disk of the moon. The great luminary was so reduced by this film of clouds that, like Agamemnon in the toils of Clytemnestra, it could hardly be said to shine at all. It peered helplessly forth over the green meadows of Avalon, so that stubborn Christian spirits such as Matt Decker had the satisfaction of being able to confront the great Light Lord and stare him full in the face without blinking. The result of the veiling of the sun was only a watery diffusion of liquid luminousness flowed over every object that emerged into prominence at all, over every object that had any form or any outline. All were equally blurred and softened. Thus it became about that a moon-like circle of pallid whiteness looked forth upon a world from which every harsh projection, whether of stone, of wood, or metal, or horn, or scale, or feather, or bone, or rock, had been obliterated. A world of flowing curves and sliding shadows, a world of fluctuating shapes and melting contours. What this veiling of the sun further did was to heighten the effect of couleur. Color, as a phenomenon in the world, became doubly important. Every shade, every richness, every variety of color lent itself to this color invasion of the kingdom of form. Thus, as these three men stood together in the foot of Glastonbury Tor, the grass of the hillside seemed to be of an incredibly rich depth. It was like a mounting wave of palpable greenness, into which, if you began to walk, your feet would sink down. "My idea is," said John at length, when Sam had rised up from the search for mosses of the underside of the prostrate tree, "my idea is to have the regular fair down here on this level ground. But the miracle play, or whatever you like to call it, I want to have on the slope of the hill, with that tower as my background. Do you catch my idea?" "Let's sit down a second," said Sam, taking a seat on the fallen tree. What I want to do," said John, looking around him, "is to try and realize this place with the crowd of people moving about, in booths and tents and bands and so on. I can't imagine it, but after all, when you cross any ordinary fair field at this time of year, it's impossible to see it as if it is when it's crowded with people." He seated himself by Sam's side as he spoke, and Mr. Evans sat down too. The position of the three men when thus seated was as follows. John was nearer the Tor, that is to say, southward of the others. Mr. Evans was nearest Chalice Hill, that is to say, northward of the others, while Sam had the middle place opposite the spot of the horizon where the gap between Havyot breaks the ancient line of trenches thrown up to repel the Danes. Mr. Evans sat starkly upright on their log. His black overcoat hung about him to his thin knees like a priest's cassock. His black bowler hat was pulled so low down over his forehead as to resemble the hat of a Jewish comedian on a music hall stage. He leaned forward on the nondescript cane, picking up anywhere, but he bent his head over his folded hands, as if he had been a chieftain out of Ossian's poetry, brooding over some irrevocable doom. Sam wore a very rough, thick Norfolk jacket. His knickerbockers were stained, worn threadbare, very faded, his woollen stockings were slipping down, and as they slipped they no longer concealed his heavy woolen drawers. Sam's cap had been pushed back off his forehead, and his wrinkled animal physiognomy scowled forth in a puzzled and nonplussed protest at a world that contained both good and evil to a degree beyond the fathoming of his simple spirit. As for John, he had brought by Mary's advice an overcoat at Wallop's which was really a bargain. Now that this new overcoat destroyed his trampish appearance, not that it didn't, but it made him look more like a thief or rogue or even a furtive-eyed card sharper than he had done when tidied up with his English adventure by his French grisette. Mary's attempt to give him a gentlemanly air had only given him a shabby genteel air, an air that was very disconcerting to the girl, and for which she could not quite account. John looked, in fact, exactly like that tricky showman he was, calculating the possibilities of his midsummer circus. The overcoat which Mary had chosen for him hung on his lean figure like a garment he had stolen. It was as if some well-dressed man, passing down a road, had tossed that coat over the wooden crossbeam of a dilapidated scarecrow. He sat sidewise in a hunched-up position, prodding the earth with his hazel stick, and looking first at one of his companions and then at the other. Every now and then, however, he glanced stealthily at St. Michael's Tower on the top of the Tor, as if that were a fourth person in this colloquy, whose temper, just as incalculable as that of the other two, had to be kept an eye upon, lest it should make trouble. It was after one of these superstitious glances that he suddenly broke out, "You see that ledge over there? That's where I'm going to have my crucifixion." The terrible word came with a shock to the ears of the other two men. "Will it be allowed?" asked Mr. Evans. "How do you mean, allowed?" said John. "By the police, Mr. Evans means," said Sam. "By the public opinion. You must remember, Crow, this is a Protestant country. You seem to have forgotten how they killed Abbot Whitting on this very hill." "I really meant by the Glastonbury people themselves," explained Mr. Evans. "But it's true that they let that devilish king kill their abbot here." "He was a Welshman like you," said John. Mr. Evans surprised him by the depth of his sigh he gave to at this point. "What a sigh was there," quoted John. "The heart is sorely charged." Mr. Evans sighed again. "Whose is not?" he muttered. Sam was now lost in heavy ponderings as he stared at the brown papered parcel containing St. Augustine, which he had tossed down on the grass when he had begun searching for that specimen of moss. His was not a nature to be carried away by any sudden idea. The feelings that had been fermenting within him at this late had only been stirred up. They had not been created by his passion for Nell, but the girl having gone back to Zoyland's bed had been a shock to his deepest pride, and by his new gesture of complete renunciation he was, in some subtle way, recovering his threatened life illusion. As for Mr. Evans, a most singular idea had just entered the Roman skull under the Jewish comedian Black Hat. Why should he himself not play the part of the crucified in this blasphemous mummery of the mountebank? In the agitation of this thought, Mr. Evans actually took off his bowler hat and, standing up on his feet, stretched out his arms in the manner of a crucified person. That one of his hands held in his hat while he did this was nothing to him. He was startled by the magnetic wave of emotion that poured through him as he made this sudden gesture. Sam did not notice what he was doing. John thought he had got cramped and was stretching himself. Mr. Evans let his arms drop and addressed John in an eager voice. "I'll go over to your terrace, Crow," he said, "and play the crucified for you, so that you can see how it looks." John was delighted with that offer. "Isn't that splendid?" he cried in a high-pitched voice. "Bravo! That's the very idea. How decent of you, Evans. What a good thought." Sam regarded this transaction with a very uneasy eye. If he found it hard to say that Creed, with the simplicity of his father, anything that smacked of blasphemy, brought an evil taste into his mouth. Mr. Evans walked up the hill till he reached the grassy terrace. This time he put down both his hat and his cane. He also buttoned up tightly his long black overcoat. In this guise, he raised himself to his full height, flung back his head, and stretched out his arms. I'll leave it at that, with the crucifixion about to begin. I'll get some good metaphysical, trippy-dippy stuff in there this time. Classic Glastonbury. So until next time, I'll see you there. Cheers.